I've been exclusively doing the anterior delt press for over a year and a half now, always seated with back support, never standing. This switch has allowed me to push my delts to the highest level without stability ever becoming a limiting factor, even with weights far exceeding my own body weight. As a result, my shoulders have grown a ton, and I notice better carryover to all incline presses. On top of that, my ability to strict press heavy weights wasn't compromised, as sheer brute strength gains override any technique shortcomings. Overall, I'd argue that this is the superior overhead press for hypertrophy. Practically speaking, the gains are nearly identical to the Smith machine version, so feel free to interchange them depending on your setup and preferences. That said, what I want to emphasize today is that despite the amazing benefits of the AD press, also known as the anterior delt press or Alpha Destiny press, it was a genuine mistake to fully switch over and abandon the classic OHB. Now, this isn't a mistake in the purest sense of hypertrophy training, although I'll briefly point out that the standing overhead press was responsible for the majority of my shoulder size. After all, it was only during my previous bulk where I managed to achieve a 242 AD press, and this year, 245 times 2 in the low 180s. So I am stronger, but not significantly more so compared to when I was only doing the OHB. With time factored in, I'd estimate this was maybe 10% more effective. But gains aside, because I will admit that the AD press absolutely yields smoother progressive overload, the drawback is that with increased strength also came worsened fatigue, which is primarily because you can push harder with this variation. So constantly pressing the 200s per reps was taking a destructive toll on my recovery and leading to much faster overuse. Then, always locking the back in through the bench in the vertical plane led to some shoulder pain, which I hadn't experienced in years. Why is this the case? Well, there's minor scapular restriction, which you may not feel right away, but can take time to manifest into discomfort, as it eventually did in my case. Also, because you're not maintaining a 100% vertical position, but rather being around 75 to 80 degrees, you lose overhead pressing mobility as you get bigger, essentially becoming somewhat muscle bound. So what I realized the hard way after moving away from my OHB roots is that they were essential in keeping me injury free and mobile. It also biases the side delts more, so stability aside, seated and standing are functionally not the same, even for the antagonist stabilizing muscles, which was once considered a con but can also be viewed as a pro, particularly in the context of a higher intensity program where you want overall mass building bangers. Though interestingly, it doesn't take much effort to restore what is missing from the AD press and some of the so-called problems of the OHB being a bad hypertrophy movement, because that statement is blown out of proportion. In fact, the great news here is that you don't require much to retain all the benefits of standing presses. At a bare minimum, just one set per workout can do magic. Therefore, I highly recommend back off work after your AD press. This way, you're pre-fatigued and can focus on pristine technique without overloading. You'll still get the groove in. So instead of doing 3 sets of AD press, I advise 2 sets of AD press followed by 1 set of OHB. Or you can alternate every training session like a 50-50 setup. So Monday can be a heavier session where you do low rep AD press, and Thursday can be lighter where you do moderate or high rep OHB. This approach gives you about 4 to 6 sets of targeted shoulder compounds per week, split perfectly between seated back supported presses and standing non-back supported presses. And that's literally all it takes to solve all possible issues. And since making this adjustment, it's only been over a month now, all my shoulder overuse is gone, and the standing OHB feels like it never left my program. Now, funny enough, Natural Hypertrophy also figured this out 2 years ago and mentioned this in our first interview. I should have listened to him then.
Nothing helps the health of the rotator cuffs more than vertical presses. I used to be someone who was plagued with shoulder issues because of my benching habits, and I always found that if I skewed it more towards overhead press, not only would I progress more on the bench, but I was less injured. Even though I don't want big shoulders, I don't want them to become a weak point. So I can stick to relatively low weights, but still do it every 10 days so I can maintain the muscle, I can maintain the function, and it stays in my back pocket.
At the time, he was trying not to overdevelop his shoulders and primarily favored horizontal pressing. However, he quickly realized that his shoulders felt infinitely better by incorporating overhead pressing at least once a week. So even though he runs a hypertrophy-only channel, he's still able to recognize the nuances of favoring vertical presses for joint integrity. So it's not enough to just say, well, this exercise is superior because of motor unit recruitment. No, Even though the stimulus could very well be better, the net side effects may not be. And that could be a deal breaker in the long term. Actually, some of you OGs may remember that my original protocol for limiting shoulder pain involved extremely lightweight overhead press, done for higher reps with a shrug at the top, which I learned about from Mark Ripito. And every time I've done this, it always made my shoulders feel godly and would cure pain before and if it ever showed up. That's because you're refining the scapulohumeral rhythm in the vertical plane. And I've also noticed that by regularly doing the OHP, I feel less tight during pull-ups of all things, especially with a super wide grip, which matters here. So maybe you don't need a bunch of mobility work, just exercises that strengthen you in similar joint angles, regardless of whether it's pulling or pushing. Speaking of which, another underrated benefit is that the OHP complements handstand push-ups. Why? But when you're strong enough to do it correctly, it's basically fully vertical, if not 90% close enough. And because there's a stability requirement, in this case you're moving through space, standing up with an engaged core and rigid body positioning while the scaps can move freely is obviously more specific. Now, the OHP may not be your primary choice, like doing another bodyweight variation like pipe push-ups, but you'll find that both still reinforce one another because of this stability aspect, which is only advantageous carryover-wise. Lastly, when discussing stability in the context of hypertrophy, it's true that the OHP eventually becomes very challenging to progress on due to this factor, and thus, seated variation should be favored, but the question is, when does one reach that point? And does stability truly become the limiter for most lifters? The reality is, no. I estimate that around 80% of lifters, especially novices, will never be hindered by stability issues. Like if you're overhead pressing 95 to 135 pounds, why are you even worrying about these details? Personally, I made the switch well after reaching a 225 OHP at a body weight of 185, and this was recently in 2022. Thus, even for late intermediates, the stimulus to fatigue ratio is generally phenomenal, and anyone who can perform 3 sets of 10 with even one plate does not need to stress about stability hindering their gains. With full range of motion and control, this weight is very workable. Truthfully, the problem of downregulating force production typically comes into play when you reach a bodyweight overhead press. Anything below that is fair game. So if you weigh 185 and can overhead press anything less than that in the 5 to 10 rep range, then you're probably in a perfect situation and don't need to completely abandon the overhead press. Which, by the way, if I'm keeping it 100, even I can't consistently hit my body weight for reps, especially in a leaner condition or if I'm using specific hypertrophy techniques. So pressing 135 to 165 with slow and controlled form is extremely challenging and more than enough. Which begs the question, what's the excuse? Well, there isn't any. You just need to set your ego aside and perform the OHP correctly. Bring the bar below the chin. Consider using a closer grip to involve more arm bend. Don't excessively lean back and lower their weight under slow control instead of dropping it to your clavicle, which is all too common. You can also mix in brief pauses, which in total will make you around 15 to 20% weaker. This way, the OHP can once again be a premium hypertrophy movement with a legendary stimulus to fatigue ratio, which will leave you feeling like $1,000,000. So that's why I've reintroduced this old school, incredibly effective, time-tested mass builder. It promotes shoulder health, complements various vertical movements, and helps you maximize results with lighter weights when you prioritize proper bodybuilding technique. Give it another shot, and I'm confident your delts will start growing once more. So with that said, feel free to share your experiences if you discovered the same benefits that I did. And let me know if you favored the AD press or OHP. Let me know, and I'll talk to you all next time.